Hello, welcome to the channel. So we are starting the series D.ed Special Education IDD syllabus. I hope this helps. So the first course, the first paper is Introduction to Disabilities. In the first paper, we have our first unit, Understanding Disability. So we are gonna start with that. Our first we have 5 subtopics here. We are gonna cover all that one by one in 5 videos. So first subtopic is historical perspectives of disability, national and international, and models of disability. So let's start the first subtopic. Disability is not a new concept and not something that has emerged as a result of increasing numbers of people affected. Rather, disability is an ancient concept that has existed for as long as people have existed. Although disability has not changed, our views of the meaning of disability have changed over time for the better. So, early views of disability. In the medieval era, in the medieval era, disability was considered a punishment from God for one's sin or misbehavior or that of one's ancestors. Others over the centuries have viewed disability as the work of the devil. Disability was seen as a failure, deformity, or defect of the individual. As a result of the myths about disability, people with disabilities were feared and often stigmatized, shunned, abused, or condemned. People with visible disabilities were even used for entertainment. For example, court jesters or oddities in circuses or freak shows. Children and adults with severe disability were kept at home, isolated, and hidden from the public view. They were often denied what others received, including education, care, employment, and a place in the family or in society. Disability was viewed as inability, and those with disabilities were often viewed as a burden to their families and to society as a whole. People with disabilities have been considered sick or unhealthy. Being healthy and having a disability have been perceived as a contradiction in terms. Disability was seen as an issue blamed on the individual with a disability. Quality of life of individuals with disability was often seen and still is by some to be poor by others who have very negative views about disability, even though only an individual can determine the quality of life of his or her own life. So, changing views about disability. By the 1800s, disability began to be viewed as an issue that had individual health and public health implications, as well as social and policy implications. Disability was seen as a medical problem due to disease, trauma, or other health conditions. This generally led to medical model of disability, which viewed disability as an issue of the person with a disability. The goal of medical management was cure of the disabling condition or modification of behaviors of the individual with a disability. The medical model viewed physicians as the experts who knew that what was best for those with disabilities. Those with disabilities were not seen as capable of knowing what they needed in the way of healthcare and other services. More recently, disability has been viewed as a result of environmental and societal factors that serve as barriers to the ability of persons with disabilities to participate fully in their communities or families or to obtain the care and services they need. Individuals with disability, their families, and advocacy groups have viewed disability as a consequence of an inaccessible environment and rejected the medical model in favor of other models, such as the social and biopsychosocial models of disability that address barriers to health care from different perspectives. The models of disability. Hmm. Models of disability are tools of defining impairment and ultimately for providing a basis upon which government and society can devise strategies for meeting the needs of disabled people. They are often treated with skepticism as it is thought they do not reflect a real world, are often incomplete and encourage narrow thinking, and seldom offer detailed guidance for action. However, they are a useful framework in which to gain an understanding of disability issues and also of the perspective held by those creating and applying the models. For models of disability are essentially devised by people about other people. They provide an insight into the attitudes, conceptions, and prejudices of the former and how they impact on the latter. From this, models reveal the ways in which our society provides or limit access to work, goods, services, economic influence, and political power for people with disabilities. Models are influenced by two fundamental philosophies. The first sees disabled people as dependent upon society. This can result in paternalism, segregation, and discrimination. The second perceives disabled people as customers of what society has to offer. This leads to choice, empowerment, equality of human rights, and integration. As we examine the different models in this and subsequent articles, we will see the degree to which each philosophy has been applied. We should not see the models as a series of exclusive options with one superior to or replacing previous sets. Their development and popularity provides us with continuum on changing social attitudes to disability and where they are at a given time. Models change as society changes. Given this degree of understanding, our future objective should be to develop and operate a cluster of models which will empower people with disabilities, giving them full and equal rights alongside their fellow citizens. Biomedical model of health. The biomedical model of health is the most dominant in the Western world and focuses on health purely in terms of biological factors. Contained within the biomedical model of health is a medical model of disability. In a similar vein, this focuses on disability purely in terms of the impairment that it gives to the individual. Medical model of disability. The medical model of disability is presented as viewing disability as a problem of the person directly caused by disease, trauma, or other health condition which therefore requires sustained medical care provided in the form of individual treatment by professionals. In the medical model, management of the disability is aimed at a cure or the individual's adjustment and behavioral change that would lead to an almost cure or effective cure. In the medical model, medical care is viewed as the main issue, and at political level, the principal response is that modifying or reforming healthcare policy. What it looks like: people in your community perceive you as sick because of your disability. Most services are focused on curing your disability or making you appear non-disabled instead of making the environment more accessible. For example, wheelchairs may be provided, but the streets are not accessible. Identity model. Disability as an identity model is closely related to the social model of disability, yet with a fundamental difference in emphasis. Is the identity model for affirmation model of disability. This model shares the social model's understanding that the experience of disability is socially constructed, but differs to the extent that it claims disability as a positive identity. Social model of disability. The social model of disability sees the issue of disability as a socially created problem and a matter of the full integration of individuals into society. In this model, disability is not an attribute of individual but rather a complex collection of conditions, many of which are created by the social environment. Hence, the management of the problem requires social action and is the collective responsibility of society at large to make the full environmental modifications necessary for the full participation of people with disabilities in all areas of social life. The issue is both cultural and ideological, requiring individual, community, and large scale social change. From this perspective, equal access for someone with an impairment disability is a human rights issue of major concern. Minority model of disability. The minority model of disability, also known as socio-political model of disability, adds to the social model. The idea that is imposed on top of impairment via negative attitudes and social barriers, in suggesting that people with disabilities constitute a initiative, entitative, relating to or possessing material existence. Social category that shares in common the experience of disability. The minority model normalizes the experience of disability as a minority experience, no more or less aberrant or deviant than other minority groups experiences, sex, race, sexual orientation, etc. Essentially, this is the assertion that people with disabilities are in part disabled not by what's going on with our bodies per se, but by the manner in which the able bodied majority of society views us, and either molds or does not mold itself to allow us to fit. Expert or professional model of disability. The expert or professional model of disability has provided a traditional response to disability issues and can be seen as an offshoot of the medical model. Within its framework, professionals follow a process of identifying the impairment and its limitations using the medical model and taking the necessary action to improve the position of the disabled person. This has tended to produce a system in which an authoritarian, overactive service provider prescribes and acts for a passive client. The relationship has been described as that of fixer, the professional, and the fixee, the client, and clearly contains an inequality that limits collaboration. Although a professional may be caring, the imposition of solution can be less than benevolent. If the decisions are made by the expert, the client has no choice and is unable to exercise the basic human right of freedom over his or her own actions. In the extreme, it undermines the client's dignity by removing the ability to participate in the simplest everyday decisions affecting his or her life. For example, when underwear needs to be changed or how vegetables are to be cooked. Tragedy and or charity model of disability. The tragedy and or charity model of disability depicts disabled people as victims of circumstance who are deserving of pity. This, along with the medical model, are the models most used by non-disabled people to define and explain disability. What it looks like. People in your community assume you will always need help and pity you. You are considered a burden requiring charitable resources for support. Moral model of disability. The moral model of disability refers to the attitude that people are morally responsible for their own disability. For example, the disability may be seen as a result of bad actions of parents if congenital, or as a result of practicing witchcraft, if not. The attitude may also be viewed as a religious fundamentalist offshoot of the original animal roots of human beings. When humans when humans killed any baby that could not survive on its own in the wild. Echoes of this can be seen in the doctrine of karma in Indian religions. Legitimacy model of disability. The legitimacy model of disability views disability as a value-based determination about which explanation or the atypical are legitimate for membership in the disability category. This viewpoint allows for multiple explanations and models to be considered as a purposive and viable. Empowering model of disability. The empowering model of disability allows for the person with a disability and his or her family to decide the course of their treatment and what services they wish to benefit from. This in turn turns a professional into a service provider whose role is to offer guidance and carry out the client's decisions. In other words, this model empowers the individual to pursue his or her own goals. Social adapted model of disability. The social adapted model of disability states although a person's disability poses some limitations in an able bodied society, oftentimes the surrounding society and environment are more limiting than the disability itself. Economic model of disability. The economic model of disability defines disability by a person's inability to participate in work. It also assesses the degree to which impairment affects an individual's productivity and the economic consequences for the individual, employer, and the state. Such consequences include loss of earnings for and payment for assistance by the individual, lower profit margins for the employer, and state welfare payments. This model is directly related to the charity or tragedy model. Diversity model of disability. Disability as human variation, an alternative model intended to focus attention on how society's system respond to variation introduced by disability. Scotch and Schreiner 1997. Under this model, accessibility in the built environment, for example, is not solely achieved by anti-discrimination regulation requiring a universal solution. The diversity of disability must be acknowledged. Scotch and Schreiner 1997. Schreiner and Scotch 2001 further question the socio-political definition of disability, in which all barriers faced by people with disability are built environment imposed in therefore removable. Feeling that this common underlying ideology of disability rights activists and independent living movements insufficiently recognizes that impairment does have a bearing on accessibility outcomes. Seeking to overcome the false dichotomy of ability or disability, Bash et al. 1999 pursue the concept of universalism, proposing, while the social model is now universally accepted, it is argued that universalism as a model for theory development, research, and advocacy serves disabled persons more effectively than a civil rights or minority group approach. Religious model of disability. The moral religious model of disability is the oldest model of disability and is found in a number of religious traditions, including the Judeo Christian tradition, Pardeck and Murphy 2012. The religious model of disability is a pre modern paradigm that views disability as an act of a god. usually a punishment for some sin committed by the disabled individual or their family. In that sense, disability is punitive and tragic in nature. This model frames disability as something to be ashamed of and insinuates that disabled people or their families are guilty of some unknown action that caused their impairment, but that mentality only serves to stigmatize disability, and the claim that praying heals disability is based on purely anecdotal evidence. Sometimes the presence of evil spirits is used to explain differences in behavior, especially in conditions such as schizophrenia. Acts of exorcism or sacrifice may be performed to expel or placate the negative influence, or recourse made to persecution or even death of the individual who is different. In some cases, the disability stigmatizes a whole family, lowering their status and or even leading to total social exclusion, or it can be interpreted as an individual's inability to conform within a family structure. Conversely, it can be seen as a necessary affliction to be suffered before some future spiritual reward. It is an extreme model which can exist in any society where deprivation is linked to ignorance, fear, and prejudice. Market model of disability. The market model of disability is a minority rights and consumerist model of disability that recognizing people with disabilities and their stakeholders as representing a large group of consumers, employees, and voters. This model looks to personal identity to define disability and empowers people to chart their own destiny in everyday life, with a particular focus on economic empowerment. By this model, based on US Census data, there are 1.2 billion people in the world who have considered themselves to have a disability, who consider themselves to have a disability. An additional 2 billion people are considered stakeholders in disability, family, friends, employers, and when combined to the number of people without disabilities, represent 53% of the population. This model states that due to the size of demographic, companies and governments will serve the desires pushed by demand as the message becomes prevalent in the cultural mainstream. Human rights based model of disability. From the mid 1980s, countries such as Australia enacted legislation which embraced rights based discourse rather than custodial discourse, custodial discourse, and seeks to address the issues of social justice and the discrimination. The legislations embraced the shift from disability being seen as an individual medical problem to it instead being about community membership and fair access to social activities such as employment, education, and recreation. The emphasis in the 1980s shifted from dependence to independence as people with disabilities sought to have a political voice. Disability activism also helped to develop and pass legislation, and entitlements became available to many people. However, while the rights based model of disability has helped to develop additional entitlements, it has not changed the way in which the idea of disability is constructed. The stigma of bad genes or abnormalities still goes unchallenged, and the idea of community is still elusive. What it looks like. A person with disability is able to attend the school, go to work, participate in community activities alongside non disabled people, perhaps using disability related accommodations or modifications that make the environment more accessible to them. Relational model of disability. In the late 1960s, Nerje, a Swedish social theorist, formulated the principles of normalization, emphasizing strong support of deinstitutionalization, recognition of the diversity of human condition, and belief that people with disability and normal, ordinary life, including access to the built environment, are not mutually exclusive. The work represents part of an emerging grand idea of social inclusion for people with disability in the community and within the neighborhood. Nietzsche 1969-1994. Following on in this continuum of Nordic interest in people, environment interaction, a new disability model developed around the end of 1990s, early 2000s, and has subsequently been recognized as the Nordic relational model of disability, Goodley 2011. Affirmation model of disability. The affirmation model of disability is essentially a non-tragic view of disability and impairment which encompasses positive social identities, both individual and collective, for disabled people grounded in the benefits of lifestyle and life experience of being impaired and disabled. The view has arisen in direct opposition to the dominant personal tragedy model of disability and impairment and builds on the liberatory imperative of the social model. Rooting their idea in the values of disability, pride, and perspectives emerging from the disability arts movement, Swain and French identified the affirmation model as a critique of the personal tragedy model corresponding to the social model as a critique of the medical model. Spectrum model of disability. The spectrum model of disability refers to the range of visibility, audibility, and sensibility under which mankind functions. The model asserts that disability does not necessarily mean reduced spectrum of operations. So this was the first subtopic, historical perspectives of disability, and the next subtopic is concept, meaning, and definition, and we will cover this in the next video. So stay tuned and do watch the next video for this. Thank you.